Hello everyone, this is the Earful Tower podcast and this is going to be the last episode of 2020. What a year it's been. Before we get into this episode though, first a little bit of background. My name's Oliver G. This is the Earful Tower podcast all about Paris, France, the French language and so on. If you're brand new here, you've actually come for a pretty good episode because this is sort of going to be picking out some of the best bits and it'll give you an idea of maybe where to start. If you've been here since the very beginning of the show, I think you'll also like this episode for a couple reasons. Because it shines a little bit of a light on this year through the perspective of a podcast. And I think you'll get a little bit of a nostalgic feeling, as I did when I looked through the statistics and the scroll that Eddie, my brother, has made for this episode for Patreon supporters. So get comfortable. We're taking a trip down memory lane for 2020. It's been a weird one, but there have been a lot of positives. And on this podcast, there's been deep belly laughs, there's been fun, there's been history, and there's been good news. So get settled. It's going to be the 10th most popular episode through to number 1. Bit of a countdown episode with little clips from here and there during these episodes, all the way down to the most popular, the most downloaded episode of the year. What was it? Can you guess already? Were there any superstar guests that you remember? See if you can figure it out. But here we go, the Earful Tower Year in Review 2020. I'm your host, Oliver G. Let's get into it one last time. Here we go. So what a year it was, 2020. I released 67 episodes of this podcast, which is a little over one a week, and you guys listened in the hundreds of thousands. In fact, I think there were 700,000 downloads this year, taking us up to 1.5 million, which either means that there are a lot of you out there listening, or it was just my mum who refreshed the podcast 1.5 million times. We'll never know. We will never know. But there's been... I'll tell you, before we get into the top 10, let me just do the year in review from my perspective. It started, from the Earful Tower's perspective anyway, it started with that I published my book, Paris on Air, and with a really sort of energetic and successful Kickstarter campaign. And it went so well that I planned to do a book tour across the States, the United States, and then Australia. Of course, as everyone knows, the pandemic hit, and both those tours were cancelled. I bought the tickets, I had places to stay, I had events lined up from Seattle to Miami in the States. It was going to be a 2-month trip. It was going to be mega. But that got cancelled, and that helped me empathize with all of you guys. And I really mean, I would say hundreds of messages and comments on Instagram and Facebook and email from you guys who had trips to Paris cancelled. So I can empathize with you. I understand the feeling. I didn't get to do the trips that I wanted to do this year either, although I guess they were in reverse. But so there was the book, and it was kind of bookmarked on the other end by Kylie the Crocodile, our children's book. They were the two things that took up all my time this year. But between that, I got to meet dozens of fascinating guests, some people for the first time, some experiences for the first time, and some return guests. And now we'll see that year through that lens. And we'll start off with the 10th most popular episode. And before we get into that though, I need to explain a little something about how we've calculated these top 10. It's really simple. It's just by the number of downloads that episode got. So what that means is it doesn't mean it was your most loved episode. That's impossible for me to measure. It doesn't mean it doesn't even mean you liked it at all. These are just the ones that you downloaded the most. And typically what that tells me is when people are scrolling through the podcast and they go, that one looks interesting. I guess it happened to these ones more than the others. It could just be a really good title. It could be an excellent guest. It could be that it was on a day when everyone was bored. Who knows? But throughout the year, here are the top 10 ones. And we begin with my interviewing of my own wife at number 10, Lena. And this was during lockdown, the first of the 2 lockdowns in Paris. I interviewed the Paris artist painting through lockdown. And as I said, there's going to be a little snippet from them all. So, the idea with this one was Lena was painting a drawing every day to get her through lockdown. And this was kind of interesting. This was the year when Lena sort of went from being behind the scenes to on the stage in terms of being on the Earful Tower podcast and having her social media and everything, because people started sharing her pictures. And she went from sort of I think she was just posting like pictures of Paris here and there to posting a drawing every single day, a sketch, an illustration, a watercolor. And then one day I just looked and she had like 10,000 followers on Instagram. And I was like, 10,000 followers? This is kind of serious. She should be on the show as an artist. And that's exactly what I did. So here's a little clip when I asked her about where all this painting skill came from. I just got to touch on this now because I might forget. But you're not a painter.
No, that's not my...
When was the last time you did a watercolor really? Before Christmas?
Oh, I don't even know. When I was 10, I guess.
Really? That's sick. That makes me feel sick. You're so good at it.
No.
But like people must people would practice forever to get to that kind of thing.
But I work as an illustrator on the side as well. Yeah. So I think maybe not necessarily watercolors, but I'm used to holding a pen.
Right. Could it mean there's hope for us all?
There's hope for everyone.
Easy?
No, I mean, yes, it depends. It really, gosh,
I'm always looking for I'm looking for shortcuts.
Yeah, I think
wish
so.
I could
but that Mona Lisa on the egg.
Hey, let's not go back to that. So there you have it, Lena, who might just make another appearance on this top 10 list. But the next guest is the highest downloaded guest for someone who was new on the show. So this is the highest ranking newcomer on the Eiffel Tower. So that's kind of an honor. And that honour goes to, I'm happy to say, not just a fellow Australian, but a lovely woman too. It's Katrina Lawrence. You might know her from Paris Dreaming. Here's her chatting a little bit about the concept of being a Paris dreamer.
My book actually was released in Australia a couple of years ago, and so I have had the chance the past couple of years to meet women who've read the book, and many of them have been women in their 50s and 60s who have literally been daydreaming of Paris for decades.
Right.
And they're finally empty nesters and trying to find someone to go to Paris with because they've been dreaming about it, but they never had the ability to go, but they kind of felt like they still knew it because it's in so many movies, like all the Audrey Hepburn movies. Yeah. There are so many paintings. There are so many books set in Paris. So I guess that gives a lot of women their fix. And if you do come to Paris every now and then, you kind of take little bits of the way of life and you take it back home with you.
Like an Australian bowerbird collecting blue things.
Kind of. It just teaches you about, I don't know, I think you start to appreciate the simple pleasures, like the pleasures of eating just a good piece of bread.
Yeah.
And so you take those home with you and you try to make these little Parisian rituals for yourself, even if you're in suburban Sydney.
Yeah.
Now that was a fun episode. I remember when she sat down in the studio, back in the days I used the studio, and she started talking. I just remember thinking, Kylie Minogue. She sounds like Kylie Minogue. I don't know if you guys agree, but there you go. 2 Australians on the podcast in one day. That was a fun one. Now, number 8. I told you she'd be back. It's Lena, my wife, Lena. Lena Norden-G, you might know her as at Parisian Postcards, the only person to make the list twice in the top 10, but also probably the most recurring guest, to be honest. But we did an episode, Daily Life in Paris without the tourists. And here's a clip. I asked her if she likes Paris without the tourists. What else have we... So to switch sort of more to an interview format, as this show usually is. Do you like it, the city, when it's empty of tourists?
I have to say I do.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Why? I mean, there's just more space. There's more breathing room. There's, space, air, floor space, seat space. Table space.
I think Parisians like it too, and a lot of Parisians have been doing touristy things that they perhaps usually wouldn't.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, just look at us. It's kind of like the same.
We're being real touristy tourists at the moment.
Yeah.
But also the mayor of Montmartre, who I did a walk show on in Rue des Abbesses and beyond the other day, said he took his children up the Eiffel Tower recently.
Right.
Which Parisians rarely do.
It's very rare.
Now, number 7, the 7th most downloaded episode of 2020 is an interesting one, before I say the name, because I remember last year, this guest was on the show last year, and she's an extremely popular woman, and when she shared the episode, that was by far the most downloaded episode, but this shows a lot about how the Eiffel Tower has grown is that when she shared this episode in the same way, and it had the same kind of spike, it didn't make such a difference because there's so many more people who are subscribed to this show and listen to maybe every episode. So that taught me a little bit about the podcast itself. But the guest is the ultimate Parisienne. It's Caroline de Maigret. And she was on the show talking about Parisian women and Pigalle. Now, she had a new book out called Older But Better But Older. There's a cool behind the scenes on this story of how I think a lot of people know the story of how I met Caroline de Maigret. And if you don't know who she is, she's a supermodel. She's the ambassador of Chanel. She's a big deal, and she's really lovely, and she's cool. And the behind the scenes story is something I really want to share on this episode one day, but she forbid me from mentioning it in this episode at least. So we'll let that go for a while anyway. But here she is talking about how getting older isn't necessarily always a bad thing.
And it's completely okay. It's just all those surprises that hit you and you're like, oh, okay, well, I've got to get used to that new thing.
But they're not all bad surprises, as you wrote in the book.
They're not all bad, but no, it's just, there are lots of really cool stuff, which is, learning how to know yourself, learning how to know your anxieties and like feel them come. And work around them, and understand toxic situations or people and avoid them, and you just feel much more serene and confident.
Caroline de Maigret, she said something so kind when I asked her to do a quote for the back of my own book. So there she is, number 7. Now we're at number 6. Another return French guest. It's Monsieur le Maire, Ariel Weil. And nowadays, he's the mayor of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th arrondissements of Paris. Maybe he'll be the mayor of Paris one day. That would be exciting. And I had him on the show via Zoom to talk about the lockdown being lifted. Everyone was so positive back in May because we thought everything was over. But we had a really good chat. Every time he's on the show, I get a lot of good feedback. He's an interesting man. The episode I did with him about the Notre Dame fire was a particularly good one if you want a bit of background on him from the show. That was a really good episode. But in this one, we just talked about what would happen next, how the city would change, and how a mayor goes through a lockdown. So there you go, the 6th most popular episode, and it was called The Lockdown's Over, So What Now for Paris? Here's a little snippet from it.
And I was myself quite impressed and happy when I heard some of the birds singing. Right?
Yeah.
So I think we all experienced that, working from home and having birds sing right close to us.
Yeah. It's been the same up in Montmartre. I didn't know there were any birds up here because there's very little green space where I live. And many different kinds of birds too, not just pigeons. Have you noticed that?
Oh, yeah. I wasn't talking about pigeons. There's not that much romantic about the pigeons, but we've had, I'm not so good about birds' names, but we've had, I don't know what it was. I can't say it. Yeah, I think I had a corbeau. How do you say corbeau again? I forgot.
Crow. It's a crow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ariel Weil. That's the man, the myth, the legend, the mayor on the Eiffel Tower podcast. That's what you get on this show. You get a mayor, you get a supermodel. That's kind of what it's like, isn't it? A little bit all over the place, just like Paris. Now we're into the top 5. And I remember thinking when I was sitting during the lockdown in my little Montmartre apartment, which I've since moved from. Talk about a big year, goodness me. I remember thinking about the people who'd be pretty affected by a lockdown, everything in Paris being closed. And I did a couple of episodes about it. I talked to people who work in cafes. I talked to a food writer. But I was also pretty intrigued by, I know people don't like the word influencer, especially because it sounds like influenza and we're talking about pandemics here. But I'm talking about people who make a living by, having an Instagram account where they show Paris and they show themselves going to fashion shows and stuff like that. So I called a couple of them, 3 of them. In fact, I called Karin Olsen, Lindsay Tremuda, and Sophie Nadeau. And I talked to them all about, what it was like to be shut down And it was the 5th most popular episode of the year. Sometimes when it comes to podcast episodes, you can kind of predict which ones will be popular, because if you have influencers on who have big following, it's kind of like if Michael Jordan was on David Letterman. You know it's probably going to be a popular episode, right? So here you go. I guess these are the Michael Jordans of the Paris world, perhaps. Here's Karen Olsen giving the answer what it's like to be an influencer in Paris in a 1-minute version.
You work a lot online. You're a freelancer, Instagrammer, influencer, however you want to say it. I can't imagine it's typical days for you right now.
In some ways, I think yes, and in some ways, definitely not. I think that I'm quite used during calmer periods during my work. I'm quite used to working from home. So that's something that I feel super comfortable with. I spend a lot of time at home anyway. So I'm not like one of those people who goes like from an office to all of a sudden working at home. So That part I can do. That's fine. The part that is not so normal is the fact that I usually travel a lot, and I usually work with other photographers, and I'm outside a lot and around a lot of people, and that is definitely not happening.
So there you have it. That was the 5th most popular episode of the year. Karen Olsen, a Swede. If you like Sweden, you should check out my new podcast. There's another thing that happened this year. I started the Earful Sweden, a new podcast. So you can check that one out after you've listened to this one. But now we're getting into the top 4. The top 4. Exciting here. And technically, this is a new guest on the podcast, coming in 4th place. But at the same time, it's less an episode about the guest than it is the subject matter. And the subject matter is the Shakespeare and Company bookshop. In this episode, I went in there upstairs when it was closed. We sat inside the reading library, me and Adam Biles, who's the events manager there. And we're sitting there, empty room, a cat, books. And Adam, who'd been here for 15 years, worked in the bookshop for 3 years, had a lot of interesting things to say. And it was exciting for 2 reasons. One, the bookshop had just opened again, so you're about to hear him explaining how it was empty. But it was also really exciting for me because my book had just come to Paris, and they were stocking it. They just agreed to stock it. So I was really excited about having the book in the bookshop, my favorite bookshop in the city, maybe just in the world. So here's a little clip, Adam Biles, behind the curtains of the Shakespeare and Company bookshop.
Right.
Yeah.
And you guys haven't escaped?
No, I mean, so we were closed for 2 months, from the middle of March to the middle of May, by order of the French government. It's an odd thing, particularly, I think, for this bookstore, because anybody who knows about the bookstore knows what a lively place it is. I mean, there's always people visiting. I mean, we have people from all over the world coming to see the bookstore, to explore it, to spend time in the reading library, to obviously to buy books. But on top of that, we also have our tumbleweeds, and the tumbleweeds are the young writers who live and sleep in the bookstore. And this is something which has been going since the bookstore opened in 1951. And so it's never not been occupied. And for 2 months, it was more or less empty.
So yeah, that episode was cool too. He talked about tumbleweeds. There was a cool bit in the episode, if you go and check it out, where he talked about the tumbleweed, which is a sort of a helper who works there, the one who'd been there for the longest period of time. You'd never imagine how long this person had been there, but you have to listen to the episode to find out. Now, don't forget, my book is on sale in the Shakespeare and Company. If you want to get it, you can get it from them, which will help support them, because I know they're going through a tough time. Or if you feel like you've supported them enough, you can get it from my own website, which, I mean, really is much better for me, but I also want to see Shakespeare and Company thrive. So I'll leave the choice in your hands if you fancy getting the book. But let's get into the top 3 episodes of the Eiffel Tower in 2020. And a little bit of background. Number 3, the topic... Okay, let's go right back. The lockdown had just finished. Lena and I had been cooped up in a tiny apartment in Montmartre that even now thinking about it, I can't believe we did it. It was summer. We spent a lot of time on these balconies that were about the size of like a map, like a road map that you fold out. Not even that big, half of a road map that you fold out and look at. That's how small it was, and we were cramped up there trying to get some sunlight. And then I got an email from Leah Walker, who works with Paris Perfect. They do apartment rentals, and she said, look, our apartments are all empty because the tourists can't come to Paris. We'd like to see what you can do in the 7th arrondissement of Paris. Why don't you come and stay in one of our apartments? And we couldn't believe our luck. Lena and I jumped on the scooter, headed over there, and we ended up staying for ages. I think it seems wrong that it could have been 2 months, but I think it was 2 months. And in the middle of that, I sat down with Leah, and we did an episode that I called A Closer Look at the Elegant 7th Arrondissement of Paris. So here's a little clip of it. It's Leah talking about Little America. And, I'll let her explain it. But here it is, A Closer Look at the 7th Arrondissement of Paris.
People, even though you have the Eiffel Tower right here, it really, right now there's no tourists.
It's crazy right now.
There's no tourists, but it's a neighborhood, and it has more, in this quartier, there are more boulangeries and patisseries per capita than anywhere else in Paris. And so where you have boulangeries and patisseries, you have actual French people.
Yeah.
So it's you see kids and families and old people, and so it's not just tourists and expats. I like to call it Little America, because you have the American Library right here. You have the...
That's on Montessori, or however you pronounce it, right there. Yeah.
The American Library, the American University in Paris. You have the American Church. What else?
Where's the American Church here?
It's facing the Seine.
Do you know, once I went there to meet with some people working there, long story, but the priest, I don't know if it's the same guy, is a basketball player, tall guy, and he showed me they have a private basketball court in there.
Do they?
Yeah, and it's my dream. It was my dream to play one-on-one against the priest. He's young. He's like 30 years old.
It's not a priest because it's a Protestant
pastor.
church. It's a pastor.
It's a pastor.
Or a minister.
I like the word priest, though, but it is a pastor, and I wanted to play one-on-one against him, throw up some Hail Marys, if you know what I mean. It seems like a dream already. Those apartments are absolutely lovely. I'm not sponsored by them. I'm telling you the truth. Next time you come to Paris, you should consider staying with them. Paris Perfect. It's just an apartment living in the city rather than in a hotel. There's something really charming about it. And the ones we stayed in were always a stone's throw from the Eiffel Tower. And I loved it. So there you go. That was the third most downloaded episode. Now we've come into the top two. The top two. Number two was a fun one, because when I was sitting there in lockdown again, maybe you're new here, maybe you don't remember, but everyone in Paris was confined to a radius of 1 kilometer. And what that means is you couldn't walk further from your house than a kilometer, and you could only be out for an hour every day. So a lot of us who stayed in Paris, we got really used to this circle that surrounded our house. I was in Montmartre, so I got to know every single street. I thought I knew every single street, but I didn't. Now I really do. But I sort of wanted to know what the people I know, friends of the show in different areas of Paris, I wanted to know what they were up to and what their radius looked like. So I called on 5 people. And the 5 people were Veronique from France with Vero, Jay Swanson from YouTube, Adrian Leeds from House Hunters International, author John Baxter, and Boris Petrovich from Paris in Person. I called all 5 of them for a 1-hour episode, and I just asked them how they're doing in the lockdown and what it's like. And what's cool about all those 5 people is they all live in different neighborhoods near loads of famous sort of monuments and stuff. Included among them all was like the Eiffel Tower, the river, we had the Arc de Triomphe, we even had the suburbs, we had the left bank, and with me and Montmartre, that made 6 people talking about Paris and talking about it when it was empty. And it was just sort of a collection of observations. It was kind of a time capsule document now that I think about it. And that was just a really cool episode, an interesting episode. What does Paris look like in lockdown? And I asked them all to send a bunch of pictures. So if you want to see, that's all on the website. If you're a Patreon supporter, by the way, Eddie has made a beautiful scroll gathering all this stuff together, all the links and a lot of behind the scenes too. But there you go. I'll give you a clip from that episode. Boris Petrovich, the tour guide, Boris the Brain, comparing COVID-19 to the plague. Now, he knows his stuff, so this isn't him trying to freak everybody out. This is just an interesting historical comparison. I'll leave it with Boris.
Drawing comparisons with the history of... Sorry to put you on the spot as well, but drawing...
No worries.
My question is, do you see any parallels in history with what's going on now in Paris?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you could say that there was a lot of parallels with the outbreak of cholera in the 19th century and like the famous Spanish flu, influenza in the beginning of the 20th. I mean, the most poignant parallel, I would say, would be with the Black Plague that took place in the middle of the 14th century and that ravaged Europe by storm. I think that would be like a more apt comparison because that was really like a European and Asian event. You know, all these other pandemics like happened in a more or less isolated space, but this like pandemic really took most of the known world. You know, the Black Plague, the Black Death, or the Great Plague. So yeah, it's something that, you know, is really comparable to today because a lot of wealthy people use the occasion to flee the cities and just go in the countryside, you know, isolate themselves. So they kind of spontaneously did what we were ordered to do now, you know, and then like waited for the whole thing to pass. And then the people who didn't have the means to travel, they would stay in Paris and they would kind of roam around the half-abandoned city, you know, which was even more dramatic back in the day because a lot more people were dying, you know, a lot more people were actually diseased. There wasn't really a system of healthcare established. And the Great Death was actually something that put the idea of the public health system in order, you know, because there was such a strong necessity for it that people started thinking about the city differently. They started dividing the city into sectors, into districts, into like little boroughs, you know, so they would know like where the contagion is the worst. So they would know how to isolate you know, and quarantine the people. So it really had this profound influence on the history of, you might say, not only urban planning in Paris, but also thinking about the city and how people live together and like what's the idea of the community and how you can spread disease through, you know, contact, which is another thing because that's interesting because they didn't really know how disease was spread. They were only speculating, you know. We only found out how the Black Death worked by the late 19th century. And in the 14th, when it was happening, it was all still a mystery, you know, and speculations and, yeah.
So that leaves us with number one, the number one episode of the 67 that I released this year on a podcast that so far has had 1.5 million downloads and it was recommended this year by the New York Times for being one of the best travel podcasts. So what do you suppose was the top episode? The question is, was it a fantastic guest? Was it just a really good episode? Now, I'm not going to mess around. I'll tell you what the episode was and then I'll tell you why it's important. The top episode was The Trick to Starting a French Conversation. And the special guest was me. It was just me explaining what I considered to be the trick to starting a French conversation. And it was about a part of my book, Paris on Air, my memoir. There's a little small couple of pages in there where I explained the trick to starting a French conversation, which I'll play for you in a second and explain. But this taught me a whole lot of things, really. Firstly, it taught me that I don't always need a guest for the podcast. It also taught me, when I wrote my book, I remember I reached out to a couple of newspapers trying to get a bit of publicity for the book. And it was self-published, and I didn't have a name for myself, really. And they just ignored me. All of them ignored me. And instead of getting upset about it, I just thought, well, the Eiffel Tower podcast, I built it from the ground. So who cares? I don't need to rely on newspapers. They didn't talk about me at the start. They didn't talk about this book. Why don't I just talk about it? And I picked a part of the book that I thought people would be interested, gave a good headline, and I just did my own episode, and it had, I think, 9,000 downloads. 9,000, just under 9,000 downloads. So here's a clip from it, so you can get a little taste. This is me explaining the trick. This is the crux of it, the nucleus of the idea of how to start a French conversation. Have a listen. So where'd this myth come from that Parisians don't smile? Who cares? The point is, you should ignore it. Instead, here's my little tip if you want to make a Parisian smile back at you. Now, this only really works if you speak a tiny bit of French, and not too much, mind you. You go into a shop or a cafe, you smile at the person, and when they say bonjour, you respond with bonjour, ça va, meaning hello, how are you? Any Parisians reading this will scoff, as will most French people in general, because it's absolutely not done in France. French people never ask strangers how they're going. What a waste of time. And they don't care either. And to be fair, why would you care? But that's the whole point. I know this is true, and yet I'm doing it still, on purpose. You see, ça va, those 2 little words and 4 letters are playing an enormous role in setting the scene and putting you in it. So yeah, there you have it, ça va. And it taught me, I hope that taught you something, but it taught me that I guess the best person who's going to promote me and my work is going to be myself. And with a good title, it can make a very popular podcast episode. Now, if you like that little bit, and if you want to know more, the book that I wrote and published this year is called Paris on Air. For me, the best way you can get it is not from Amazon. Not from Amazon. It is from me, theeiffeltower.com/memoir, and we'll send it out. And it's been really touching to see how many people have read that book and reviewed it. I've listened to that episode, not least. But it brings up another interesting point. I need to say a few words of thanks, especially about that book and how it's got into your hands around the world. And this ties in also with our new book, Kylie the Crocodile, which you can get on theeiffeltower.com/croc. Is, I don't know if a lot of you guys know this, but self-publishing a book, especially one that's kind of popular in that it sells more than, 100 copies, is that it's extremely difficult to do the distribution, especially when I live in Paris and the books are printed in New Jersey. So what happened with both of these books is people emailed me and said, "Hey Oliver, I love the show. If there's any way I can help out, let me know." And I said, "Look, this is a big favor I'm going to ask you, but maybe you could help me with the distribution." And a number of people jumped in and helped out. And what that means is I sent books to them from the factory. They put them in envelopes and sent them out to you guys, especially in America and Australia and Canada, because for me to send it from Paris to all those countries is just too expensive. So, an especially big thanks to Cindy and Jim in Chicago, who have been on both books, and same with Nan Moss in Paso Robles, and the same with Lachlan Cook in Seattle. Those 3 people have helped on both books in America. I can say the same thing for Sally Porter in Melbourne. So any of you guys who've bought that book in Australia have got it from Sally Porter. What a lovely woman. What a great help. And when it comes to Paris on Air, Lida in Texas and Juan in Washington, D.C. have been helping there. And if we jump north across the American border to Toronto, Rob Hall has been helping with both books there. So to all of you guys, an extremely heartfelt thank you for making the distribution so much easier. Without you, I can honestly say, without your guys' help, I would have done it myself, and I would never have been able to put out all the stuff that I did this year. There's no way, because I know how much work goes into it just doing it from the Paris side. And speaking of the Paris side, thanks to Mike and Shelley, who've also helped out, Tom Clark from Khartoum, who stored the books, and to everybody who has stocked it. Also, a mega thanks to Janet Holstrand for editing both books. Actually, lovely woman. If you ever need a book edited, look up Janet Holstrand. And then lastly, the big thanks I want to give out to is to the Patreon supporters, the people who have listened to this show and said, I want to see this go to the next level, and they've jumped in with a monthly pledge. In fact, Patreon has made it so you can jump in with an annual pledge now. So you pay for the whole year. It won't take any money out of your bank account throughout the year until the year is over, if you decide to sign up for another year. So you can do that now. Patreon.com/The Earful Tower. 590 people can't be wrong. Go and join them because it helps me make the show better. And how it's going to keep making the show better is I got Eddie doing all kinds of work behind the scenes, editing difficult episodes like this, making these beautiful PDF scrolls with all the extra information for the Patreon supporters. And when he's doing that stuff, it means that I can focus on doing other podcast episodes, videos, and so on. The other thing this year is the Eiffel Tower has become a company, which took a lot of behind the scenes work too, and it means I've been able to bring Lena on full time. So this thing is growing. We're going to keep making it better. I like to think It has been getting better with every month of the year. So it's working. If you're ready to join me in 2021, I've got some great adventures planned. I want to bring you along with it. You don't have to sign up as a Patreon. It's going to be out for free. But if you're a member, the benefits are almost endless, and you are helping make this thing what it is. So I'll leave you on that note. The Eiffel Tower 2020 is over. A happy new year to everyone, and a deep and sincere thank you to everyone for listening and for everyone who has helped out. Happy New Year, and see you in 2021.